So my topic is the pluralistic city, deprivatized post-consumerist. It was a city that was based on the city holding human interaction as a form of commodity over that of the market economy, and it was to see how that kind of those kind of cities would develop and what those kind of cities would look like. I have two precedents today, and the first one is MIT's Building 20. During World War II, the U.S. military they needed a research center for the development of radar technologies that would help fighter jets in identifying enemy bombers. MIT they were commissioned for this research. So, in one afternoon, they designed this building, and it was constructed in less than 6 months. It housed hundreds of researchers from MIT and all over the U.S. But after World War II, when it was originally set to be demolished, but MIT they found a use for the large space, and they introduced lots of different disciplines and departments into this single building. Those include like the Laboratory of Nuclear Science, the Linguistics Department, the ROTC, Particle Accelerator Research Group, and many others. So what resulted was an amalgamation of people and groups who knew little or nothing about each other, coming together in a space that was essentially decaying with time. Leaks, poor ventilation, heat and cooling problems. But by the time it was demolished in 1988, after about 40 years of its lifetime, the Building 20 was considered as a legend of innovation, widely regarded as one of the most creative spaces in the world, quoted by Joan and Lahira. So after it was demolished, people looked into why this large Turing building became one of the home of many records of breakthroughs throughout its 40 years of life. And it's widely believed that the reason was because of the building's environment that fostered discourse. The building with its no real means of hermitage for each of the departments often led the users to get lost, forcing them to ask for directions. They talked about how there was only one vending machine in the entire building, so often the hungry researchers, they were forced to meet at this point. So such aspects like this, which may seem quite informal, but they were powerful symptoms of the building that induced dialogue between the people and often knew nothing about each other. Another aspect of the building that forced interaction was the horizontality of the building and its use of hallways. Henry Zimmerman, an electrical engineer and resident of the building, explained, chance meetings in the elevator tend to terminate in the lobby, whereas chance meetings in the corridor tend to lead to technical discussions. Another aspect was the building, because it was designed as a temporary structure, it didn't even meet the proper fire codes, and it was given its name just because it was designed as a temporary structure. They believed that this aspect of the building that aided the creativity inside the building. So because no one had much of an interest in its longevity, the researchers felt free to adapt the physical environments to fit their needs. More often than not, without consent, walls were torn down, bolts were added to the roofs, and on one occasion, a scientist working on the first atomic clock cut holes through 2 floor slabs to house a 3-story tall cylinder. This flexibility is what allowed the building to be alive as long as its inhabitants. It adapted to the needs of the users, and in turn, inside what was essentially a single building, multiple typologies, all reflective of its individual users and their spaces, was made visible, a pluralistic society. So as an application of this model of the MIT's Building 20 to a city scale, we can look at 3 aspects to be developed. The first one being the building and its no real means of hermitage, which would mean a mixed-use city, not like that of modern-day Auckland, where the quarters and precincts are given different disciplines, but all these kind of blended and dispersed. And the other was the hallways, which are essentially the infrastructure of the building. So the infrastructure of the city, it should be one that acts not only as a place of movement, but also a place that caters dialogue and interaction. And finally, the pluralistic nature of the building. So if we think of a typical, of going back to the transport, if we think of a typical model of infrastructure, what we see is just individual cars on a motorway. Essentially what that is just private moving spaces. So finally, the city should be supportive of and accept a pluralistic society, a city where private ideals are exposed to the public and public back to the private. As such, the city should allow, to a certain extent, the flexibility for the city to adapt to its inhabitants, allowing many typologies to develop and taken away throughout time, really allowing the city to live with its people. So that was MIT's Building 20, and the second precedent that I looked at was the coffee house. It's more of looking into a culture as opposed to specific architecture. So during the Byzantine eras, so the coffee they were in the Byzantine states, but by the early 17th century they came to England, and in England they really flourished in numbers. And people say it could be argued that the introduction of this new beverage opened up a culture of reason, and I'll go into that now. And a letter in the period quotes, whereas formerly apprentices and clerks used to take their morning draught in ale, beer, or wine, which by dizziness they cause in the brain make them unfit for business. This was paraphrased by Stephen Johnson as the entire city was drunk all day long as a default state. And with the introduction of coffee, they use now to play the good fellow in this wakeful and civil drink. So in contrast to the obvious effects of liquor that was often consumed in substitute of the dirty water at the time, coffee acted as a stimulant, which meant drinkers were often more sharper and more productive, allowing the shift from depressive to stimulant. This new sound stimulated state, accompanied by the spaces to cater for them, introduced a new culture of public dialogue. At the time, 17th century, coffee houses were considered places outside of the government buildings where political discussions were possible. They were places where people held forth their expressions of issue that were of public concern. The whole insurance policies of Lloyd's of London developed from Lloyd's Coffee House. Coffee houses were often referred to as places of penny education. This referred back to the affordable price that came with purchasing coffee, meaning that the coffee houses, they were places where all the different people, all the different classes could kind of gather and hold dialogues and conversations. It's also believed that constant dialogues within the coffee houses were supported by the readily available newspapers. Thus, the coffee house fulfilled the definition of the public sphere, a place where private individuals gather to reason about public issues. In Diderot's encyclopedia, he explains coffee houses as manufacturers of ideas, both good and bad. The rapid growth of drinking coffee as a culture could be seen in terms of a growth in establishments that were supportive of interaction. In contrast to liquor, no one buys rounds of coffee, nor do people drink multiple cups of coffee in one sitting. And as a hot drink, coffee was a non-expensive, slow-drinking beverage, which would often limit itself to 1 cup per person. Therefore, from an economical perspective, it was not beneficial for beverage businesses to introduce or encourage the coffee culture. And in this sense, what was supported by the coffee house as a typology was not a space of economic consumption, but a place which held interaction and dialogue as a form of commodity. As unrelated as it may seem, it is not by accident that the age of reason is in parallel with the rise in caffeinated beverages. In terms of architecture, it's not the object architecture that is of concern, but a programmatic architecture. Whilst fully accepting that it may have been by mere chance, through the development of coffee houses and its consequential effects, what is apparent is the program, rather than space, being the definitive factor in inducing social exchange. It goes without saying that not all programs can have this effect, but around the same time coffee houses were flourishing in England. France had its own program that had similar results, the Salon. When comparing the two programs, it is clearly visible the similar characteristics they share. They were both welcoming of all classes. They induced dialogue, and more importantly, they were not spaces that had predetermined topics. They created a public sphere in which anything and everything could be expressed, discussed, and debated. Those are my two precedents.